The key that I'm going to share with you today will help you write a short story of any length. Whether you've got one page to work with or you've got 30 pages that you can use, this is what you need to know to make sure that it turns into an actual story. Today, we're going to talk about the moment of the story. So, what is the moment of a story? The moment of the story is the place in which everything changes. So let's use Cinderella as an example, and I'm going to draw it on the board here. So Cinderella, if you'll recall, everybody's probably read the storybook or seen the Disney movie or something like that at some time, but Cinderella starts with this kind of pretty good life, and she loves her father and all of this, but then she gets this stepmother who might not be so nice. And then the father dies, and that's not so good. And then those stepsisters and the mother turn really, really wicked. And then she gets this invitation to the ball, but she can't go. Even when she tries, those wicked stepsisters, they tear up her clothes. And finally, she ends up locked in the tower, and there's no way that she's going to the ball. Her life started pretty good, but now she's like a slave, locked in a tower, no parties. There's no fun at all. But then something important happens. The fairy godmother shows up. And once the fairy godmother shows up, her life begins to dramatically improve. The fairy godmother just being there, that's pretty fun. She's got this new friend she never knew she had before. But then the fairy godmother gives her a new dress, and the fairy godmother, gives her a coach, and the fairy godmother gives her footmen and a coach driver and all of these things. And then finally she arrives at the ball where she dances with Prince Charming, and boy, she's just over the moon at that point. And so we see that this is the trajectory of Cinderella's story. She starts pretty good, but then things get pretty bad until she's in a really, really bad spot here. However, the fairy godmother shows up, and suddenly things get off the charts good. And of course, we know that the story continues after that, but for the sake of talking about short stories today, let's pretend that this is your short story. So what is the moment of the first half of Cinderella's story? Well, looking at the diagram makes it pretty easy, I think. The moment is right here when the fairy godmother shows up. When the fairy godmother shows up, everything changes. Cinderella's life was on a particular trajectory prior to the fairy godmother, but then after the fairy godmother, we get a completely different trajectory. So this is the moment of the story. So you've probably heard that a short story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's especially challenging when you need to have a very short story, like if you're doing a 1,000-word challenge of flash fiction or something like that. But knowing the moment of the story helps us to make that determination on how to organize the rest of the story. Because we can place this moment anywhere that we want, but we're going to achieve a different effect when we do that. So here we have it right in the middle. If this was our short story here, we have this moment of the story right in the middle. And so we get about half the story that would show us one side of the arc, kind of all the bad things that are happening to Cinderella. And then in the other half of the story, we get to see what she does with it after her trajectory changes. But what happens if we move the moment of the story to the beginning? What if instead of our story looking like this, we make it look like this, where things get bad really fast, but then we have a long time to the end of the story? Well, this allows us to see how a character reacts to adversity. And so certain themes are going to lend itself to placing this kind of moment at the beginning of the story. So we get this really, really quick fall from grace where we're going to put a character in a bad position right away, but then we get to see what kind of stuff they're made of after that moment of the story, see how they react, how they use it, or fail to use the advantages that they've received in the moment of the story. By a similar token, we could put the moment of the story at the end of the story. We could start and we could have this long, long, long fall out of grace where things are getting worse and worse and worse, but then something changes, and then we get this really quick resolution at the end. And that's going to provide a completely different feeling to the story. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, but generally, negative moments of the story work better at the beginning of the story. For instance, if your character is in an accident, somebody close to them dies, or they receive a mission that seems impossible. We want to see that at the beginning of the story, because what we're really interested in as readers is how they react to that adversity, what they do after they've been put into an unwinnable situation. It's a general premise that the happiest parts of your story are the most challenging to make interesting. So typically we want a pretty fast pace through those positive parts so that we can see the stuff that your character is made of when they're put into an adverse situation. So by the same token, positive moments of the story often work better at the end. We want to see all of the things that happen that are bad to this character and how they react to them, how they adapt and change through those situations before the good thing happens that maybe provides an ironic twist. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule, but generally when you're thinking about the moment of your story, consider when is it that everything changes, and what's the most interesting part of that story before or after the moment that I want to spend time on and I want to share with your audience. So oftentimes when we are writing a short story, this idea of the moment comes in revisions. I know that often when I write a short story, I'll maybe have an idea for a character or a premise that I think is interesting, and I'll just kind of start writing, and maybe I'll have a general shape of the story in my mind, but I just kind of got to get the ideas out on the page. And after I have a reasonable draft of the short story, or at least maybe some things fleshed out or outlined a little bit, then I can look at what I have and I can say, what is the moment of this story? Now that I see it on the page, when is it that everything changes, and what are the most interesting parts of this story? And I can combine that information to identify what's the moment of the story that I just wrote. And then in revisions, I can shift that around. Do I want to build out the beginning before the moment happens for some reason? Do I want to shrink the beginning and get to the moment faster? And by the same token, we can ask the same questions about the end. And sometimes you'll write a draft and you'll be looking for the moment of the story and you'll say, oh, well, it really doesn't have one. I don't find any moment of the story in here. And that's a great thing to find in drafting, because it means that you haven't really written a story. If nothing changes, then it's really not a story. You may have written a vignette, which is sort of like a story, but has more focus on descriptions and developing the premise and things like that, but in which nothing undergoes any change. So you may have a vignette, you may have some sort of essay, but if there's no moment that you can identify that things really change, that the story turns on, then you haven't yet written a story. So that's great information as well. You can look at what you have, you can figure out what you're getting close to, what feels like it sort of changes, so that you can further develop those ideas and find a precise moment and then turn the story around that moment. Especially when you want to make a story shorter, find the moment of the story. Even in that first drafting stage, you may write 2,000 words, but knowing that you can only write a 1,000 word story. Well, it's okay to write those 2,000 words, just kind of, vomit all of the information and all of the ideas that you have onto the page. That's a perfectly reasonable exercise. But then you come back to that. You identify the moment of the story, and then that allows you to cut out the pieces that don't actually interact with that moment. Once you identify what really causes the character or the situation to change, then you can look at all the other interesting ideas that you had, all the other pieces that were fun to write and that you love to write and that you want to include, but you can ask the question, which of these things actually relate to the moment of the story that I've now written, and what can I remove from the story entirely? So take this idea into your work. As you're writing, ask yourself, what is the moment of the story? And when you can identify that, it's going to make the story so much stronger. Hey, what are you still doing here? Did you want more? Oh, well, the best way to get more is to come to our apprenticeship. We can have conversations like this every day. Learn more at writers.company/apprenticeship.